This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Murders at Karlov Manor. So far we've looked at all the cards that appear in Play Boosters from the main set, and today we're going to take a look at the remaining cards that appear in Play Boosters, that is, the cards from the list subset and special guest subsets, which are made entirely up of reprints. While you won't see these cards quite as often as we've seen cards from bonus sheets in the recent past, you will see them often enough that it's worth taking a look at them. Play boosters are, of course, brand new and have replaced draft boosters, and here's how those packs break down. 1 in 8 Karlov Manor Play Boosters will contain a card from the list or a special guest in one of the pack's common slots. In other words, each draft will feature about 3 cards that appear in this video. The list is a subset of 40 cards while there are 10 special guests. Here are some reminders about how my set review videos work. In this video, I'll be evaluating each of these cards for how they will play in Limited. That means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate my discussion of each of those cards with a letter grade. If you're unsure what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. As is often the case for bonus sheets, there are an inordinate number of Fs in this video because frequently cards that get printed in these sets aren't really intended for Limited at all. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in. We'll look at the cards from the list first. First, we've got Baleful Mastery, which for 3 generic and a black is a rare instant. You can pay 1 generic and a black rather than pay its mana cost. If 1 generic and a black cost was paid, an opponent draws a card. Exile target creature or planeswalker. The floor on this is that it's a 4 mana instant that exiles a creature with no questions asked. Most of the time you don't want to pay that alternate cost, but having the option is definitely upside. This is a B. Next up, it is Smuggler's Copter. So, the list is almost identical in paper and on Magic Arena, but there are 3 exceptions, and Smuggler's Copter is one of them. On Arena, you'll have Smuggler's Copter instead of Baleful Mastery. For 2 generic, it's a 3/3 artifact vehicle, and it has flying, and when it attacks or blocks, you can draw a card. If you do discard a card, it has Crew 1. This was a bomb last time, and it's a bomb again. It's easy to crew, it's got grace stats, and it's evasive, and looting will help you dig through your deck for what you need while loading your graveyard in a format where that really matters. As a vehicle, it's pretty much immune to all sorcery speed removal. It's colorless, and it goes great in any deck. It's an A. Next up, it's Bishop of the Bloodstained, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 vampire cleric. When it enters a battlefield, target opponent loses 1 life for each vampire you control. There are vampires in this set, but not nearly enough for this to be worthwhile when it has such an underwhelming stat line. It's just a really bad fail case to play a 5 mana 3/3 that makes your opponent lose 1 life. Even in a vampire heavy set, which is where we saw it last time, it didn't perform that well. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Burden of Guilt, which for 1 white mana is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. You can pay 1 to tap enchanted creature. This is cheap enough to be a pretty nice removal spell. Sure, you've got to keep paying 1, and your opponent does get windows where they'll be able to use tap abilities and stuff like that, but this still gets something out of the way fairly efficiently, and I think that makes it a C+. Next up, it's Cavalier of Thorns, which for 2 generic and 3 green is a 5/6 elemental knight. It's got reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 5 cards of your library, put a land card from among them onto the battlefield and the rest into your graveyard. When it dies, you can exile it, and if you do, you put another target card from your graveyard on top of your library. This is a really beefy creature, and it helps load your graveyard for evidence collection, and even lets you recur some stuff from your graveyard. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Evolutionary Leap. This will be on Magic Arena instead of Cavalier of Thorns. For 1 generic and a green, it's an enchantment. You can pay 1 green and sacrifice a creature to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So giving up a creature on your board to get one from your deck into your hand is rarely worth it in Limited. It gets a little more interesting with creature tokens, but this is a D. Next up, it's Combine Chrysalis, which for a green and a blue is an uncommon artifact. Creature tokens you control have flying. You can pay 2 generic, a green and a blue, tap it, and sacrifice a token to make a 4/4 green beast creature token, activate only as a sorcery. There are tokens in this set, but not so many that Combine Chrysalis will always be giving stuff flying when it comes down. The big idea here is to sacrifice clues to make 4/4 flyers, and that'll be pretty good, but it's also not insane when you're having to spend 4 mana to do it. I think this is a D+. Next up, it's Consigned to Oblivion, which for 1 generic and a blue is an instant. It says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. It's a split card with Aftermath, though, which means once it's in your graveyard, you can cast the Aftermath side from your graveyard. The Aftermath side is Oblivion, which for 4 generic and a black is a sorcery, and target opponent discards 2 cards. This was pretty nice when we saw it last. The Consigned side is always a passable limited card, and then once it's in the graveyard, you can get a couple of cards out of your opponent's hand. If you mill this, you still get some value out of it, and it also works pretty well with Collect Evidence because it has a combined mana value of 7, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Death Cloud, which for X and 3 black is a sorcery. Each player loses X life, discards X cards, sacrifices X creatures, and sacrifices X lands. This is symmetrical and very difficult to make work correctly in Limited. It's an F. Next up, it's Possibility Storm, which will be on Arena instead of Death Cloud, and it's 3 generic and 2 red for an enchantment. Whenever a player casts a spell from his or her hand, that player exiles it, then exiles cards from the top of his or her library until he or she exiles a card that shares a card type with it. That player may cast that card without paying its mana cost, then he or she puts all cards exiled with Possibility Storm on the bottom of his or her library in a random order. Like Death Cloud, this is symmetrical, very hard to make it work correctly in Limited. It's an F. Next up, it's Duskmantle, House of Shadow, which is a land that can tap for 1 colorless, or you can play a blue and a black and tap it, and target player puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. In this format, you're going to want to use this on yourself more than on your opponent, especially if you're collecting evidence, which is reasonably likely in blue-black. It does hurt your mana base, and the utility it offers isn't amazing, so you probably need a pretty good mana base and a lot of graveyard stuff to really want to use this. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Enlisted Worm, which for 4 generic, a green, and a white is a 5/5 worm, and it has Cascade. This means when you cast it, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost, put the exiled cards on the bottom in a random order. A 6 mana 5/5 that will virtually always give you a 2-for-1, and usually impact the board with whatever it cascades into, whether it's removal or another creature, is really, really good. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Ghost Quarter, a land that can tap for colorless. You can tap it and sacrifice it to destroy a land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle their library. This format has nice non-basics, but not so many that you want to be running Ghost Quarter. Yeah, you can use it on yourself to try to fix your mana, but you're also 2-for-1ing yourself when you do that. It's just an F in Limited. Next up, it's Gnaw to the Bone, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. You gain 2 life for each creature card in your graveyard, and it has flashback for 2 generic and a green. This is a graveyard format for sure, especially in green, and in the past, Gnaw to the Bone has worked reasonably well in really grindy graveyard decks by buying them the time they need to grind out a win. I could see this filling a similar role here, but that means it needs a build-around grade, because it's probably an F in most green decks and a C-level card in really grindy graveyard decks. Next up, it's Goblin Warchief, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior. Goblin spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and goblins you control have haste. Not enough goblins in this set for the Warchief to be worth it. It is a 3 mana 2/2 with haste on its own, but that's pretty bad, giving it a D. Next up, it's Hard Evidence, which for 1 blue is a sorcery that makes a 0/3 blue crab creature token, and you investigate. This is really good for this format. You get 2 nice pieces of material for only 1 mana, and you even add something to the board. This format has tons of payoffs for clues, and this gives you so much value for only a single mana that I think it's a B-. Next up, it's High Alert, which for 1 generic, a white, and a blue is an enchantment. Each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Creatures you control can attack as though they didn't have Defender, and you can pay 2 generic, a white, and a blue to untap a creature. Obviously, this is a build-around. You need lots of high toughness creatures, especially because this will even make your creatures with lower toughness than power do damage equal to their toughness, and that's a pretty big problem. It wasn't easy to make it work back in Ravnica Allegiance, and I don't imagine it has that impressive of a ceiling here either. It's a build-around D. Next up, it's Ixidor Reality Sculptor, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/4 legendary wizard. Face-down creatures get +1/+1, and you can pay 2 generic and a blue to turn a face-down creature face-up. Ixidor is back, and he's got a whole lot of face-down friends in this format. Making those disguised creatures into 3/3s is not a small thing, and he even gives you an alternate way to turn them face-up. I don't think he really needs a build-around grade, as this format has plenty of disguise, giving him a B-. Next up, it's Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, which for 1 generic and 3 blue is a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Jace. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. The +1 says target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, draw a card. And the -8 says draw 7 cards, then if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. I wouldn't count on making the alternate win condition part go off all the time, but it can happen in this format. His +1 is nice, and you're usually going to be milling yourself, so it does get you closer to your win condition while stocking your graveyard, and obviously the -8 can be nice too. The bad news is he doesn't do anything at all to protect himself or impact the board, and triple blue is hard to get going, so I think he's a C+. Next up, it's Krozen Tusker, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 boar beast. It has cycling for 2 generic and a green, and whenever you cycle it, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand and then shuffle. This card's always nice when we see it. When you cycle it, it's basically a 3-mana draw 2 that gets you any basic land you want, and then later in the game you can play it as a big, albeit inefficient creature. It works really well with Collect Evidence, as it puts itself in the graveyard early, making it easier for you to collect Evidence 6 in the early stages of the game. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Kaldatha Rebirth, which for 1 red is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice an artifact. Put 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield. So, what they want you to do here is give up a clue to make 3 1/1 goblins, and that's not bad, especially because the blue-red deck has plenty of sacrifice stuff going on. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Laid to Rest, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever a human you control dies, draw a card. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you gain 2 life. This was surprisingly bad back in Crimson Vow. I overrated it in the set review back then, and I don't see that changing here, especially because this format doesn't have a heavy human or +1/+1 counter theme. Even if you have humans or counters, you then have to have your stuff die before this does anything. It's an F. Next up, it's Leonin Relic Order, which for 2 white is a 2/2 cat cleric. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile an artifact or enchantment. When it leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. On a lot of board states, this will have something to exile, and might be a clue, which isn't that exciting, except that your opponent never gets it back, and sometimes it'll be able to hit really powerful permanents, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Magma, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 elemental. You can pay 1 and sacrifice an on-land permanent, and it deals 1 damage to any target. The idea here is to give up your clues to ping stuff, and that can be pretty nice, but a 5-mana 4/4 body is pretty miserable these days, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Mass Hysteria, which is 1 red mana for an enchantment that gives all creatures haste. It's symmetrical, and your opponent's likely to reap the benefits before you do. It's an F. Next up, it's Maverick Thopterist, which for 3 generic, a blue, and a red, is a 2/2 human artificer with Improvise, which means your artifacts can help cast this spell. Each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1 generic. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. This was great back in Magic Origins, and it's going to be great here. It basically gives blue-red another Signpost uncommon, and it's a really nice one. Even if you pay the full 5 mana, you're getting a solid deal, and improvising to play this more cheaply isn't that hard with all the clues, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Mentor of the Meek, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 1 generic. If you do, draw a card. Black-white has the same theme as Mentor of the Meek, that is 2 power or less stuff, and that works well with Disguise. This can definitely give you some nice card advantage, but it doesn't always line up nicely, and that's a problem for a Grey Ogre. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot, which for 2 generic is an artifact. When it enters a battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. You can pay 2 generic and a black and sacrifice it to draw a card and lose 1 life too. So ultimately, this can give you 2 cards, but it takes some time and some serious mana to get there, and black isn't exactly a color into doing stuff with artifacts in this set. You could play this in blue-red, and that might just be the best place for it, where you're just happy with the enter the battlefield ability, and then you sacrifice this for value, but it still doesn't seem very good, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Millstone, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact. You can pay 2 and tap it, and target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. Yeah, no thanks. Sure, you can use it on yourself to set up Collect Evidence or try to mill your opponent out, but it takes a long time to do either of those things effectively, and it does literally nothing else. It's an F. Next up, it's Mistvale Plains, a land plains that enters tapped and can tap for white mana. You can pay 1 white mana and tap it to put a card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Activate this ability only if you control 2 or more white permanents. This is a plains that enters tapped, and it has fairly minimal upside. 9 times out of 10, you'd rather just have a plains. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Molten Psyche, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. Each player shuffles the cards from his or her hand into his or her library, then draws that many cards. And it has Metalcraft. That means if you control 3 or more artifacts, it does something else. In this case, it deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards that player has drawn this turn. Getting Metalcraft is possible for red decks in this format, and that does something to break the symmetry of this wheel effect, to some degree at least. The bad news is your opponent is still likely to take advantage of all those sweet new cards before you ever do, since you spent mana casting this first. When you don't have Metalcraft, this is outright bad, giving it a C. Next up, it's Monologue Tax, which for 2 generic and a white is an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure token. Yeah, no thanks. This won't make enough treasure to be worth the card or the mana. People just don't double spell enough in limited. It's an F. Next up, it's Mystery Key, which for 1 generic and a blue is an artifact equipment. Whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it. If you do, draw 3 cards and it can equip for 1 mana. Giving this up to draw 3 is appealing, but having to hit your opponent first is a very real hurdle. It's an artifact and that matters in blue, and it's also kind of funny to imagine putting this on a disguised creature and making your opponent block it before you can turn it face up and just crush their blocker, but this card has some serious problems, giving it a D. Next up, it's Nyx Weaver, which for 1 generic, a black and a green, is a 2/3 enchantment creature spider. It's got reach. At the beginning of your upkeep, mill 2 cards, and you can pay 1 generic, a black and a green, and exile Nyx Weaver to return a card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a great graveyard enabler in a set where that matters, and if you milled something you really want to get into your hand, it can get it back for you, while also sporting some passable stats, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Putrid Warrior, which for a white and a black is a 2/2 soldier zombie. Whenever it deals damage, choose 1. Each player loses 1 life or each player gains 1 life. Most of the time this is going to trigger like once, but that's not a terribly exciting card. It's mostly a bear with really small upside, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Quintorius Field Historian, which for 3 generic, a red and a white, is a 2/4 legendary elephant cleric. Spirits you control get +1/+0. Whenever 1 or more cards leaves your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. This was bad in Strixhaven, no matter how much I wanted it to be good, and it's pretty weird for this format because red-white isn't a color pair with very much collect evidence. I don't think there's any of it at rarities lower than rare, in fact. So you can't really go off by getting 3/2s, and the format doesn't really have spirits either, and this creature just isn't efficient. He's an F. Next up, it's Ranger Captain of Eos, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 3/3 human soldier. When it enters a battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. You can sacrifice it, and your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. Ideally, your deck has a few 1-drops in it for you to play the Captain. The good news is there are plenty of playable 1-drops these days, so it's reasonably likely this will draw you a card. The sacrifice ability isn't amazing and limited, but sometimes you just want to make sure your opponent can't interact, and it can set that up. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Shard of Broken Glass, which for 1 mana is an equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0. Whenever a equipped creature attacks, you may put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and it equips for 1. They want us to use this to enable graveyard shenanigans, but the boost it offers is so underwhelming that it just isn't worth it, just like it wasn't when it was printed originally in a set with Delirium, giving this an F. Next up, it's Spell Snare. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant that counters target spell with converted mana cost 2. This isn't here for limited. It's way too narrow of a counterspell. It's an F. Next up, it's Stromkirk Captain, which for 1 generic, a black and a red, is a 2/2 vampire soldier with first strike. Other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. Again, there aren't nearly enough vampires around for this to be awesome, but a 3-mana 2/2 first strike is passable, and you are likely to have like 2 or 3 other vampires around. I think that makes this a C+. Next up, it's Sir Conrad the Grim, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/4 legendary human knight. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent, and he can pay 1 generic and a black, and each player mills a card. He has the potential to trigger a ton in this format because people will be milling themselves and removing creatures from their graveyard. It will be especially devastating in a mirror match, but even if you're the only graveyard deck, he'll do some nice work, giving him a B-. Next up, it's Treacherous Terrain, which for 6 generic, a red and a green, is a sorcery that deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of lands that player controls, and it has basic land cycling for 2. Because this has basic land cycling, it gives you some nice fixing and helps you set up collect evidence, so it's hard for this to be bad. In the extreme late game, it can actually be a legit finisher too, giving it a C. And our last of these The List cards is World Spine Worm, which for 8 generic and 3 green is a 15/15 worm. It's got trample. When it dies, you put 3 5/5 green worm creature tokens with trample onto the battlefield, and it's put into a graveyard from anywhere. You shuffle it into its owner's library. If you can cast this, your opponent probably can't win, but that's not going to happen much in Limited. It doesn't even work as a reanimation target or collect evidence fodder either, since it gets shuffled into your deck. That shuffle thing can mean it can keep you from getting milled out or something, but that's such a narrow case that you're not interested in that. This is an F. All right, let's move now to the special guests. These are significantly rarer than cards from the list are, so keep that in mind. First up, we've got Ghostly Prison, which for 2 generic into white is an enchantment. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 generic for each creature they control that's attacking you. This tax can be a burden for your opponent, as it can make them choose between trying to race or developing their board. If you're really far behind, it isn't that useful, but at parity, or if you're ahead, it can be nice, giving it a C. Next up, it's Fabricate. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a sorcery that lets you tutor up an artifact. 3 mana tutors aren't good in limited. It's like adding a tax of 3 mana to whatever your best artifact is, and it isn't like this format has a ton of great artifacts anyway. It's an F. Next up, it's Show and Tell, which is a sorcery. Each player may put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card from their hand onto the battlefield. Nope. This is great in Legacy and Vintage, where you can put absurd stuff into play that your opponent has no hope of matching, but in Limited, there's a good chance you lose the game by casting this. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Tragic Slip, which for 1 black mana is an instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and if a creature died this turn, that creature gets -13/-13 until end of turn instead. This is nice removal, although if you can't get Morbid going, it is pretty mediocre, but that's the card's fail case, and setting up Morbid isn't that hard for this 1 mana spell. It's a B. Next up, it's Victimize, which for 2 generic and a black is a sorcery. It says choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So if you have some fodder in a well-stocked graveyard, this can give you some awesome value. The setup is real though. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Gamble, which for 1 red mana is a sorcery that lets you tutor up a card and then put it into your hand and discard a card at random. This is another nope. 2 for 1ing myself and hoping I don't discard the card I just tutored up is a good way to lose. It's an F. Next up, it's Crashing Footfalls, which is a sorcery with Suspend 4 for 1 green mana. That means, rather than cast this card from your hand, pay 1 green and exile it with 4 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter. When the last one is removed, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. And because Crashing Footfalls has no casting cost at all, this is pretty much the only way you can cast it. I suppose you could get that worm we saw earlier and cascade into it, but that's definitely a corner case because we're talking about 2 cards from this subset that you're very unlikely to ever get together. Anyway, once it does get cast, it creates 2 4/4 green Rhino creature tokens with Trample. If you suspend this on turn 1, there's a pretty good chance you're winning that game. And if you do it on turn 2 or turn 3, you're kind of in okay shape as well. But if you get it later in the game, drawing a card like this that does absolutely nothing for several turns is a pretty big problem. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Tireless Tracker, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 human scout with landfall. Whenever a land enters a battlefield under your control, you investigate. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you put a +1/+1 counter on Tireless Tracker. This was a bomb last time, and it'll be a bomb this time. It spits out clues like crazy and grows throughout the game, and this card goes super hard on giving you those clues. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Drown in the Lock, which for a blue and a black mana is an instant. It says choose 1. Counter target spell with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard, or destroy target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. This is in a pretty awkward spot in this format because there's not really a deck that wants to be milling its opponent all that much because you can help your opponent more than hurt them, especially in this format if you start milling them. Furthermore, there's a built-in mechanic that lets your opponents exile cards from their graveyard. So it feels like this is going to be pretty tough to make it work, giving it a D. And our last special guest is Field of the Dead, a land that enters tapped, can tap for colorless, and when it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This is one of the most powerful lands of all time, at least when it comes to 60 card formats, 99 card formats, and like cubes. But in a normal limited format, it's awful. You're just never going to be able to get zombies out of it. And if you do, it's going to be in the extreme late game, and the cost of playing this tapped land and really distorting your deck to play enough lands with different names is just not worth it. This is an F. All right, so those are all the special guests and the cards from the list that you can find in Murders at Karlov Manor Play Boosters. While we've now looked at every card that can appear in the booster packs that you'll be drafting in this format, there are more things to talk about. I'll be doing an archetype guide for the format, a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format, and once it's on Magic Arena, I'll start drafting this format too. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on this set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.